But we also look at brain imaging to look at structural and connectivity changes in the brain. We look at genetics that may be influencing these changes. Then we also look at other markers in the brain as well as in the blood to try to identify normal from abnormal brain aging, and in particular to actually predict the development of dementia and look at the risk factors and prevention of dementia. My name is Perminder Sachdev. I'm Scientia Professor of Neuropsychiatry at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. I'm also co-director of the Centre for Healthy Brain Aging at the same university. I also work as a clinical neuropsychiatrist and director of the Neuropsychiatric Institute at the Prince of Wales Hospital in Sydney. So I actually grew up in India, and I actually went to school in a hill station in India called Solan. I did my medical training in Delhi at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, and then I actually spent a few years after that in New Zealand, and that's where I finished my psychiatry training. And I was planning to travel the rest of the world, but then got lured into a job in Australia, and I've been here ever since as the director of the Neuropsychiatric Institute. My passion was in the relationship between the brain and the mind, and I think this was the perfect place to actually fulfill that passion. And I followed that passion for the rest of my life. I've been here now for 37 years. My research journey has actually been quite varied. I actually started when I was in New Zealand doing research on the ethnopsychiatric aspects of Māori culture, and did my PhD on that. But then I moved to neuropsychiatry, and my first work was in drug-induced movement disorders. These are common movement disorders that we see in patients who are treated with psychotropic medication. And gradually from that I moved to the field of cognition and cognitive disorders. And we started a study in the late 90s called the Sydney Stroke Study, which led to my interest in vascular dementia. And that has been a major area of work ever since. But I also got interested in longitudinal research on brain aging. And we look at brain aging from multiple perspectives. We look at not only the change in cognitive function, but we also look at brain imaging to look at structural and connectivity changes in the brain. We look at genetics that may be influencing these changes. Then we also look at other markers in the brain as well as in the blood to try to identify normal from abnormal brain aging, and in particular to actually predict the development of dementia and look at the risk factors and prevention of dementia. The goal being eventually that we want to improve brain health of the population, especially the older population, but population in general. And we want to look at prevention of dementia or early diagnosis and intervention for dementia. Most of our funding comes from Australian government agencies, in particular the National Health and Medical Research Council of Australia, which is the major funding agency for medical research. We also have had some funding from the Australian Research Council. We get funding from some foundations in Australia as well. More recently, especially in the last 6 or 7 years, we've had substantial funding from the National Institute of Health in the United States. We've had some funding from the European Union as well, usually in collaboration with European researchers. When I was in medical school, I realized that the brain was the last frontier, and you wanted to be at the frontier of new discoveries and exciting new developments. It was the brain that you had to investigate and study better. And as far as the brain is concerned, in fact, the mind, the human mind, was the one that was most challenging. And I had an interest in philosophy and philosophy of the mind even before that. And I think this was, to some extent, combining my interest in science and philosophy, and to some extent literature as well, because I think to understand the mind, you have to bring all these different perspectives together. I read a lot, and I read a variety of different books, both fiction as well as non-fiction. I also read a lot of poetry, and I have a special interest in Urdu poetry. I write poetry. I've written one anthology of poems, and I'm currently writing another. So that takes up a fair bit of my time. I love going for long walks because I think those are very contemplative. And I like bushwalking considerably. Lately, of course, I'm also a grandparent of two very young grandchildren, and that is taking up a lot of my time more recently, and they are a great joy.